Blog Talk Radio.
Good morning and welcome to Take Aim, Accuracy in Media's weekly talk show on Blog Talk Radio. AIM is America's original media watchdog, and every week we point out biased coverage and bring you the stories the mainstream media ignore. I am Roger Aronoff, the editor of Accuracy in Media. Our guest today is former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who's with us to talk about his book and related matters. The book is called Known and Unknown, a memoir. It is available for purchase at Amazon.com and at your local bookstore, and it is currently number one on the New York Times bestsellers list, and all the proceeds of the book are going to help the troops. Well, we are so pleased to have you on here today, and I want to thank you for being here. And let me start out giving a little bit more introduction, a little more of your background. The book is an excellent read, and Mr. Rumsfeld was sworn in as the 21st Secretary of Defense and also the 13th Secretary of Defense, the youngest and the oldest under Presidents George W. Bush and Gerald Ford. During the Ford administration, he also served as White House Chief of Staff, and in 1973 and 74 was the U.S. Ambassador to NATO. From 63 to 69, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois. He's also been a chief executive officer of 2 Fortune 500 companies and was a U.S. Navy pilot. Again, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you.
Thanks. So I saw your interview with Diane Sawyer. I've seen most of the interviews you've done, and one of the issues that I'm concerned about and think about is when she says, well, you were wrong about WMD. Well, yes, the CIA definitely was wrong on the specifics. They never found the 600 tons of weaponized sarin, but there was much that was found. Hundreds of tons of precursor chemicals for chemical weapons, ballistic missiles, and even thousands of pounds of low-enriched uranium. Weren't these enough to sort of acknowledge or claim that, well, we did find WMD when we went into Iraq?
Well, you know, there also was, of course, a chemical facility up at Kermal that was in Iraq. It's not exactly clear what its connection with the Iraqi government was, but the Iraqi government was a repressive government, and they certainly knew a great deal about what was going on in their country, and we found ricin and potassium chlorate in chemical weapon suits and books in Arabic explaining how to make chemical weapons. I think that it was unfortunate that the administration did not do a good job in explaining, for example, what you've suggested, plus what was in the Delfer report after the war. Mr. Delfer went in there and actually created a report that analyzed exactly what was found. And there's no question but that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons on his own people and on the Iranians, that he had an active program and refused to allow the inspectors to have sufficient inspection and confidence that he had disposed of his supplies of chemical weapons. But of course, it did tarnish the administration, and the administration had difficult defending itself with the onslaught that came.
Right. I also noticed the difference between how Tony Blair, who when he was out on his book tour 6 months or so ago, and he was talking about, look, he said it was really more about UN Resolution 1441 as well as all the others that Saddam Hussein had failed to comply with, and that was why we went. It wasn't so much because we were certain that these weapons were there in a certain place, but it was the resolution. And so I agree with you. It seems like the message was not handled well from the administration.
I think that's right. I mean, if you think about it, Saddam Hussein was giving $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers. He had repressed his people. He had invaded Iran. He had invaded Kuwait. He had been on the State Department's terrorist list for years. The Congress of the United States in the 1990s passed legislation for a regime change in Iraq, which President Clinton signed. It was passed overwhelmingly by the Congress. All of the members of the intelligence committees in the Congress saw the same intelligence that we saw in the executive branch. The conclusion was uniform in the German and French and British and U.S. intelligence communities. And as you point out, Prime Minister Blair said that the Iraqis had rejected some 17 UN resolutions, and at the same time, Iraq was shooting at U.S. and British aircraft that were patrolling the northern and southern no-fly zones in Iraq at the enforcing UN resolutions. So there were a good number of reasons that were listed in the resolutions that was passed by the UN. There were a good number of reasons listed in the legislation and that was passed by the United States Congress. It was much broader than simply weapons of mass destruction.
So tell us what it was like working there at the Pentagon and with the New York Times, NBC, the other mainstream media organizations. Did you feel that they were generally out to get you, to make you and the administration look bad, or would you say that they acted generally fairly and responsibly throughout the war?
It's hard to make a generalization. In my book, I talk about several instances where the media has been really gotten it wrong. Early on in the book, when I was director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, I talk about a column by Jack Anderson, which, it went to hundreds of outlets. He had a widely circulated syndicate. And he claimed terrible things about me and what we were doing in the Office of Economic Opportunity. And he never checked, and they were exactly false. And I assumed, being a little naive back in 1969, that the Washington Post and the papers that carried it would retract it, and that Anderson would retract it. I invited him over there. I showed him that it was inaccurate. I listed exactly what was wrong, and there wasn't a single shred of truth in his column. And it was terribly damaging to the administration and to me and to the Office of Economic Opportunity. But he never retracted it. He wouldn't run a column. He said he would lose some of his newspapers that carried his column. And the Washington Post never carried a retraction. And it was really stunningly inaccurate. I also talk in the book about the CNN having its bureau in Baghdad, and years later admitting that they were very aware of the incredible viciousness of the Saddam Hussein regime. They were aware that Saddam's people were beating women and doing perfectly terrible things, and they never reported them. And they didn't report them, I suppose, because they didn't want to lose their bureau in Baghdad, and they probably felt that the people who told them these things conceivably could be punished by the Saddam Hussein regime. But it was a clear example of a major news organization reporting every day and not reporting the truth of what they knew about the viciousness. I also, in the book, talk about an instance where I think it was Newsweek magazine that ran a story that someone in the United States military had flushed a Koran down a toilet at Guantanamo Bay. It was totally untrue. It did not happen. As a result of their publishing that and carrying it around the world, there were riots and protests in more than one country and more than one city, and people lost their lives in the violence from this. And
so
we eventually told them about it, and they said that they printed something in Newsweek saying, in effect, that if some portion of their story was inaccurate, they were sorry. But, of course, the people were dead by the time they did that.
What about when the New York Times released information on the anti-terrorist financing system, SWIFT, in which we were tracking their use and how they transferred their funds? There didn't seem to be much sense of urgency to find leakers or hold the Times accountable. What were your thoughts about that then and now?
Well, I've been in and around government now for a lot of years, and I've lived 78 years and watched government for now a third of the history of our country. And there was that instance. There was the instance where a portion of General Frank's war plan for Iraq was revealed in the press. I guess my feeling on it is that it is just enormously difficult to find leakers from the government. I don't know why people do it, maybe for money, maybe for self-aggrandizement, maybe they have a political difference with the people in government and they want to damage them and hurt them. But whatever the reason, it puts people's lives at risk. And I've often thought that I wish the leakers and the people in the media who insist on carrying classified information in the New York Times or other newspapers or television stations. I wish they had children in the lead organizations of military operations that are compromised, because I think if they did have their own children in those operations, they would be very careful about not releasing classified information and not putting the lives of men and women in uniform at risk.
Well, speaking about leaking classified information, what about WikiLeaks? You didn't have any WikiLeaks to deal with when you were in office, but obviously you followed this and what's gone on there. What is your main takeaway from this? First, regarding the contents, and second, the act itself.
Well, clearly, as you know, the laws in the United States do not leave government many options in terms of dealing with media organizations that carry classified information. Some other countries have laws where they are able to deal with that. In our country, we can't, so we have to try to use persuasion. We do have laws against people providing that information to a news organization. And in this case, there's apparently a person who's been retained and detained, and a prosecution is being prepared, and it's against federal law. And to the extent an individual does that, they ought to be punished under federal law. Now, what's the effect of it? Well, here we are in the 21st century, the information age, and the digits are out there, and it's apparently possible for people relatively easily to compromise those digits and that information to the great detriment of our country. I think one of the effects is that people are going to be very reluctant to put things on paper. I think people are going to be very reluctant to communicate honestly and accurately what they really believe, unless it's something that's politically correct, unless it's something that is going to be seen in the world and the media as being perfectly understandable. And of course, what people in government have to have is the honest opinions of people. And the honest opinions may not always conform to what policy is or to what preference is at any given time. And people have to be willing to communicate that, or else decision makers aren't going to be able to make good decisions.
Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. Let me get one more question. Define the war that we are in today. Who is the enemy? What is the optimum outcome?
The enemy today is our radical Islamists. It is not the Muslim faith. It is not Muslims generally. It's a small minority of Muslims who are determined to kill innocent men, women, and children in an effort to impose their view on how the world ought to operate and to damage the nation-state concept. Now, for whatever reason, the government of the United States today is unwilling to say that. They're unwilling to identify the enemy. I don't see how you can win in the competition of ideas if you're not willing to, on the one hand, describe honestly what the ideas of the enemy are, those ideas, and then simultaneously talk about the virtues of free political systems and free economic systems that we benefit from. And all anyone has to do is look down from outer space on Earth, and the countries where people are doing well are countries that have freer political systems and freer economic systems. And the countries where people do not have opportunities are the ones that have repressive systems and command economies and dictatorial systems. And the enemy wants to impose that on us and on the rest of the world, and they're perfectly willing to kill any number of innocent people to achieve it.
Well, I had lots more questions, but unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. Our guest today has been former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, talking about his book, Known and Unknown, a memoir, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Again, all proceeds are going to help the military, help the troops. I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Take Aim.
Thank you, Roger. I've enjoyed being with you.